Gracias por escuchar Verdad en la Red. El video que les traemos el día de hoy es producido por el señor Michael Matt del periódico El Remnant y nosotros lo hemos traducido. Es un video sumamente importante porque habla de la situación actual de la iglesia con ciertos detalles que desconocíamos del pasado. Es un video que es para aquellos que tengan ojos para ver y oídos para escuchar la verdad.
Ladies and gentlemen, from a catacomb buried deep beneath the streets of the New World Order, this is the Remnant Underground. And now, here's your host, Michael J. Matt.
Okay, so everyone seems to be going stark raving mad, right? I mean, maybe me too. I don't know. Maybe Rob and I are going just as nuts as everyone else. But the world seems to be losing. Am I right, Rob?
I'm very lucid.
Oh, you are? Everything seems crazy. The latest thing that's got me confused is the Vatican's plan to hand out another Halo Award to one of its own.
Born in
Santa Sede. El Papa anuncia que Pablo VI será proclamado santo en 2018. Durante su discurso en el encuentro con los párrocos de Roma que tuvo lugar el jueves 15 de febrero en la Basílica de San Juan de Letrán, el Papa anunció que el beato Pablo VI será canonizado en 2018. Al final del mismo, el Papa bromeó y fue ahí donde dio la noticia de que Pablo VI será canonizado en 2018. Hay dos obispos de Roma recientes que ya son santos, dijo, en referencia a Juan XXIII y Juan Pablo II. Pablo VI será santo este año, uno con la causa de beatificación en curso, Juan Pablo I. Su causa está abierta. Y Benedicto y yo en lista de espera. Rezad por nosotros, bromeó. Se confirma así lo ya publicado por y Prensa que Pablo VI será canonizado este año, probablemente durante el sínodo de los obispos o de los jóvenes el próximo mes de octubre. Tras la aprobación de los cardenales, solo faltaría el visto bueno del Papa Francisco.
And they can do whatever they want, whatever. But the idea that nobody is seriously kind of thinking that maybe something's amiss here in canonizing Pope Paul VI, that's the part that disturbs me. Nobody cares. Everyone thinks that's normal. Something that we shouldn't even question. Paul VI, the architect of the new Mass, the godfather of the spirit of Vatican II, the man who removed his own papal crown and started the whole diabolical chain of events that led to Pope Francis.
The Pope arrived in the city, which is known as the Bastion of the Reformation. It was an historic 12-hour visit, the first by a head of the Roman Catholic Church since the Reformation split European Christendom 4 centuries ago. He was warmly greeted. The Pope, who said his visit was truly a blessed encounter and spoke forcefully in the causes of justice and Christian unity, received 2 important gifts, a magnificent cross and a private donation of £41,000 for the World Council of Churches. In return, the Pope gave a sculpted head of Christ. He then signed the Distinguished Visitors Book. Across Lake Geneva in the Parc de la Grâce, a huge crowd of 60,000 gathered to celebrate Mass with Pope Paul. Perhaps this was a time of cementing a unity in the brotherhood of man. With the papal blessing, members of the faith realized that here a huge step had been taken towards eradicating age-old differences.
Paul VI is going to get his own halo now? I'm not sure why this is. I'm not aware of any particular, cult or following or anyone calling for his canonization. They're just going to ramrod it through in the Vatican as they're wont to do. And they've got themselves a little supposed miracle now, which to me seems just this side of laughable. Well, I'm not a doctor, so someone can go ahead and send in a correction if I got this wrong. Here's how I see the miracle on which they're justifying this canonization of Pope Paul VI. There's this lady who's pregnant, and she went to Brescia in Italy, which is the birthplace of Paul VI, because her pro-abort doctor told her to have an abortion because the baby that she was carrying had a disease that sometimes results in birth defects when the baby's born. Well, I don't know who this lady is. She's not named, of course, but She prayed to Pope Paul VI for a miracle. Wow, Paul VI, of all the people to pray for when you're worried. Anyway, she prayed to Pope Paul VI for a miracle. And what do you know? What do you know? The baby was born without the birth defects. How about that? I mean, that's awesome. Now, here's where I have a little problem. There was never actually any sign that the baby did, in fact, have birth defects. You see what I mean? It was just a question of high risk. The child was high risk. The disease had a risk of birth defects. But in the end, the baby was born okay. That's it. I mean, this happens literally every day all around the world, that for whatever reason, the worst doesn't happen when you have a given disease. But for the Vatican, for the old fellas in the Vatican, it's a miracle. I mean, that's all it takes anymore. This I find embarrassing. So what I say, what really disturbs me is the lack of outrage in the Catholic world. Are you kidding me? That's all it takes. I don't know. Let me for a moment just be brutally honest here. And I premise it by saying I have to ask some questions, and I'm hoping that just in asking those questions, I haven't crossed any lines or boundaries here, but I think we should all be asking these questions. Because what we're seeing now, of course, is the canonization, not of individuals, but the canonization of the entire revolution of Vatican II. They're using canonization, the process of canonization, to make heroes of revolutionaries. I think we can all agree on that. So I'm not sure who takes this seriously anymore. I certainly don't down here, but we still want to look at this process. So the majority opinion among theologians in the past was that papal infallibility does, in fact, come into the canonization process, right? We accept that. And so under normal circumstances, you wouldn't come out and start questioning saints. Well, I don't know if it passes muster. But that was then when this consensus was made by theologians. That was then. That was before everything in the church kind of went crazy. So now, yeah, a lot of us are kind of concerned. I don't trust the Vatican's word. Do you take the Vatican's word on anything anymore? Would you leave your kids unattended in the Vatican? I wouldn't. I don't trust them. And I think a lot of people don't. But besides that, back to the canonization discussion, I mean, there must have been a minority opinion that papal infallibility did not come into the canonization process, right? So I think it's time to hear that. But the majority opinion, let's just stay with that for a moment. The majority opinion among theologians was based on what? It was based on established criteria, such as that the cause for a given canonization, the cause had to overcome all of the objections of the devil's advocate. And this was a tough guy. This was a guy who was not going to roll over. He was the one who was saying, no, this person is not a saint, should not be canonized. And he investigated to make sure that this guy that the deceased could pass all the tests, that he truly was a saint, that he truly was in heaven. Well, wouldn't you know, the devil's advocate, he's not there anymore. The devil's advocate has been eliminated entirely from the new and improved process of canonization. Does it make you a little nervous? And who was that guy? Who was the person that said, you know what? You know what's going to make this process better? If we get rid of the devil's advocate. Who's this person? And what was his agenda? Because without the devil's advocate, how do we know if the majority of theologians in the past would have still maintained that papal infallibility comes into the canonization process or declaration? We don't know that. It'd be like saying that a given murderer is, definitely guilty because he was convicted in a court of law, only to find out that the poor guy never even had legal counsel. He had no lawyer. So now in this case, there's no devil's advocate anymore. So the Vatican kangaroo court can pretty much do whatever it wants, right? I mean, that's how it seems to me. If you eliminate these things, they can do whatever they want. Well, then the argument, of course, is, well, no, because the Pope's words, with the declaration of canonization, those words suffice. Those are infallible. And again, maybe that's the case, but really? So what's the point of the process? If the Holy Father's words suffice for infallibility, obviously his infallible statement is based on the process. Obviously, a process that had to be worked out meticulously to prevent the Pope from making a mistaken declaration of canonization. You see? It worked hand in hand. Now, that process, by the way, in the past, it took hundreds and hundreds of years of meticulous research and verification of miracles and so forth before a Pope made the declaration. Thomas More, John Fisher, Edmund Campion, all martyrs for the faith. It took 400 years for them to be canonized. And today, Well, I remember Paul VI. When I was a kid, he was the Pope. Wasn't that long ago. They're just flying through these now, just pumping these guys out. Little saint-making factory. Well, it doesn't make any sense to me that the Pope would just get to trash that whole process of canonization, get rid of 2 out of 3 miracles, nix the devil's advocate, and maybe even canonize somebody for purely political reasons, and then we have to accept that as infallible. Well, maybe, but that doesn't seem to make sense to me. And it leaves the church susceptible to every manner of attack and scandal. So how can it be right? And why did they get rid of the old system, of the old process, of the old investigation before canonizing someone? Why did they get rid of all the sticky points so now we can just fire them off? Halo awards for everybody. And people say with respect to Paul VI, yeah, but Humane Vitae, that was really a great thing. And you know what? It was. Humane Vitae, the Pope's great encyclical on human life and against contraception, so it was a great thing. It was. But it was also a reiteration of previous church teaching. It also was not without some controversy because it equalized the ends of marriage, some theologians believe. As great as it was, and we defend Humane Vitae, it still was an 11th hour reiteration of what the church has always taught. So in other words, Pope Paul VI, he did his duty in the end. And if we're going to start canonizing people merely for doing their duty, you see, it sort of dumbs down the whole idea of what a saint is. Who cares anymore? It's just sort of an honorary title you give to everyone who dies and who was famous, if that's the case. Because there really was no particular cult associated with the cause of Paul VI. There was and there isn't today, other than among the aging ecclesiastical hippies inside the Vatican who are evidently bound and determined to nominate their pal Paul for a Halo Award because he represents the revolution of Vatican II. Get all these guys canonized, and who can question Vatican II? I don't really think that 9 out of 10 Catholics walking the street today would even know who Paul VI was, certainly not younger Catholics. Who was this sort of tragic figure who was sometimes called the Hamlet Cardinal, and then later he was called the Lady Macbeth of the Vatican because by pontificate end, he was reportedly reduced to walking the papal apartments at night, racked with self-doubt, weeping over the mess he and his friends had made of the church in the wake of the Second Vatican Council. He was a plagued man by the end. He was widely criticized, both by traditionalists and liberals, because he couldn't make up his mind. He was criticized for being lukewarm and indecisive, and he was not in possession of sufficient charism to win over either side. Not exactly a heroic or saintly character. I'm not saying he's not in heaven, just saying, really? He's going to be a canonized saint of the Catholic Church? When behind him, after his reign, the church, and during his reign, went through just total destruction? Seminaries emptied out, convents emptied out, the Mass was all but destroyed? Really? He's a saint now? Well, the best you can say about this man is that he seems to have had the faith enough to realize that something went wrong. And by 1972, for example, Pope Paul began to realize that, yeah, there were some pretty serious problems. And he writes, quote, "There was a belief that after the Second Vatican Council, there would be a day of sunshine for the history of the church." This is June 29, 1972, when he wrote this. And he says, "Instead, it is the arrival of a day of clouds, of tempests, of darkness, of uncertainty." End quote. So at least he had the honesty to admit that it hadn't gone right. For Paul VI also, tragically and scandalously, at least potentially, this day of clouds that he talks about also included pesky accusations of moral misconduct on his part, which never quite went away. In fact, these accusations stopped his beatification process in its tracks when the Vatican tried to trot this little pony show out back in the 1980s. And again, the great Abbe George Dunant, he threatened the Vatican at the time. He said, if this process for canonization of Paul VI does not stop now, I will expose the fact that Pope Paul VI had a homosexual relationship with some Italian actor, and he claimed to have pictures and everything else. Not saying that I have those pictures or that I can prove it, but there's a lot of smoke here. Does anyone really think it's a good idea to canonize this man before that smoke is investigated? And clearly it's not being investigated. We don't even have a devil's advocate looking into it anymore. So all of this controversy notwithstanding, it's now Paul VI's turn to be raised to the tables. The man famous for wrecking the Mass and the last pope to wear the papal tiara, having given it to the United States in a dramatic gesture symbolizing democracy's triumph over the old triumphalist Catholic Church of the past. Paul VI was a revolutionary. After 800 years of Roman pontiffs having worn their crowns in kingly service of Christ's bride, Paul VI pulls it off his head and sets it down like Napoleon crowning himself, right? After Paul, never would it be worn again, thus renouncing papal kingship in deference to the aggiornamento of the Second Vatican Council. It's a dramatic moment. It's a startling moment. And the Church has obviously never recovered from that ill-advised papal surrender to the spirit of the age. A massive blunder even Humanae Vitae, as good as it is, cannot overcome or cannot eclipse. Without that tiara, without the symbol of the Pope's authority, and all that implied, Pope Paul VI's words against contraception were just that. They were words. And in the minds of millions and millions of Reformed Catholics, Peter had become just another politician with an opinion to be ignored at will. And now, today, long forgotten, old Paul VI's dusty old tiara is still on display in the National Shrine in Washington, D.C. After Vatican II, Holy Mother Church had been completely democratized. This is Paul's legacy. Pope Paul VI's legacy is crowned, in fact, by the novel spectacle of uncrowned Roman pontiffs sitting in the chairs of St. Peter rather than the thrones. His was the last papal coronation, a breach with tradition dating back at least to the reign of Nicholas I in 858. After Paul VI, no pope would be crowned again, and Peter's successors would be elected and inaugurated into office much like presidents or prime ministers are today. So now the members of the Congregation of the Causes of Saints, which really should be renamed the Congregation for the Causes of Famous Dead People, because that's pretty much what canonization is all about, they have confirmed this extremely suspect miracle attributed to Pope Paul VI's intercession. And in October, if nothing happens to stop this farce, Pope Francis will sign the decree of canonization. We need to hope and pray that doesn't happen. Because after that, then the revolution of Vatican II will not be a revolution anymore. It will be a grand and glorious thing that saints oversaw for the greater honor and glory of God. But it should be abundantly obvious to anyone who is not asleep at this point that the modern canonization process has moved well past silliness and has gone straight into the depths of ecclesiastical narcissism. Anyone who believes, in fact, that the Holy Ghost is involved with this obvious political chicanery and opportunism is just drinking the neo-Catholic Kool-Aid by the vatful. The Vatican simply is out of control. Pope Francis is now siding with the Chinese communist bishops and stabbing Chinese underground Catholics in the back. Have you heard this? That's the latest thing out of the Vatican. If you doubt this, please go to remnantnewspaper.com and read all about it. No, check that. Don't go to Remnant Newspaper and read all about that. We'll have Rob throw up on the screen Raymond Arroyo from EWTN exposing this disaster, this betrayal of the Chinese Catholics.
Now some news from China. The Bishop Emeritus of Hong Kong, Cardinal Joseph Zen, a regular visitor to this show, says the Vatican is selling out the Catholic Church in China. In a January 29th letter addressed to the media, Cardinal Zen accused the Vatican of capitulating to the China regime and, in essence, giving its blessing on a new schismatic church created by communists. The Cardinal's letter comes days after news broke that the Vatican has reportedly asked legitimate underground bishops who are not recognized by the Chinese government to step down from their posts to make way for the installation of new illicitly ordained bishops handpicked by the government. Cardinal Zen said that the Sino-Vatican deal will only enable the government to clamp down on faithful Catholics even harder. Cardinal Zen traveled to Rome to hand-deliver a letter to Pope Francis expressing the concerns of the underground faithful in China. The Vatican is rejecting Zen's accusations.
So with a few outstanding exceptions duly noted, it's undeniable that the Vatican today is crawling with politicians, rank modernists, and even significant representatives from the so-called Lavender Mafia. Powerful forces that have infiltrated our church and that are using the bride of Christ like a cheap whore to satisfy their own perverse agenda. That is what is going on here for those who have eyes to see. Who knows where the fiasco of Pope Francis's pontificate is going to end? But it's not going to be good. And one wonders what it's going to take for Catholic men and women worldwide to finally realize that they've been had and that they have to stand up and object to this obvious scourging of Holy Mother Church at the hands of modernists, revolutionaries. As far as we're concerned, down here in the underground, the gloves are off. We're going to keep coming out here every week and trying to expose the madness. Don't know if it's going to change anything, but at least we can start the conversation. Keep the conversation going, that there is dissent, that Catholics all around the world are not putting up with this, they're not fooled by this, and they're going to speak out against this, what's happening in the Vatican. So if you want to help us out, Rob will throw the icon up on the screen there, and we'll continue to come to you every week and fight.
De ahí que papas legítimos como Pablo VI, Juan Pablo II y ahora Benedicto XVI hayan procurado mantener la nave eclesial en su rumbo, no obstante la espantosa tormenta de la apostasía modernista y el ineludible navegar del barco de la Iglesia en estas sucias y agitadas aguas. Naturalmente, los esfuerzos de estos pontífices auténticos no son bien vistos por herejes y apóstatas, así como tampoco es bien vista su gesta por parte de algunos sectores en extremo tradicionalistas de la Iglesia. Contra ellos y contra la Iglesia dirigen dardos de rencor, quienes le reprochan no aceptar los supuestos grandes logros de la modernidad y preferir permanecer en el gueto de la ortodoxia. De igual modo, quienes le reprochan supuestamente el no haberse podido mantener incólumes a ese ataque brutal del mundo y de su época.